So one of the reasons why I use the Goldstein Peavehouse textbook for this course is because they really put at the center of the story of international politics the problem of collective action. Getting people to work together and solve problems in an anarchic environment when there really isn't a framework to make that work. And so I want to talk today about why that problem exists, why it is so complicated, and then what are strategies that Goldstein Peavehouse put forward for how we might possibly tackle the collective action problem. And so the core problem, as they lay it out, and I think many folks who think about international politics kind of wrestle with, is that the problem of international politics is that there's no world government, that politics in the international system looks fundamentally different than politics that we see within states, because there's not a government that's in a position to do the kind of things the governments typically do, which is to solve collective action problems, to provide collective goods, to contribute to security and the rule of law and the enforcement of law, and or to provide public goods, whether it's roads or fire departments, education, research, the kind of things that governments typically do that maybe markets don't do particularly well, things that benefit the whole of society, addressing the market failure, so making sure that there's patent enforcement, if the banks collapse, that things are able to be sorted out in a reasonable and timely and efficient, fair way, making sure that pollution isn't dumped like crazy into the water, into the air, right? Those are the kind of things that governments typically do, and within states we can wrestle over sort of what should those regulations be, but governments have the ability to compel people to sort of play by the rules, to tax people to sort of pay for these things, and have sort of the resources and control to address these problems in a realistic way. In the international system, a lot of that framework and a lot of that structure that allows for a lot of that authority that allows for states to be able to address collective action problems and provide collective goods just simply doesn't exist. And so in international politics, we're interested in how do states and other actors solve these problems in the absence of a world government. And I'll suggest to you that maybe the problem is even more complex than that, because there are many different types of actors, right? There's states, there's NGOs, there's multinational corporations, there's criminal actors that are out there in criminal networks. Many of these different actors want different things. They have different values and different visions for how the international system ought to operate. There's just not universally agreed upon rules for solving a lot of these problems. And so we're constantly in this process of kind of making it up as we go and trying to figure out how to resolve all of these different actors with their different interests and goals and visions and resources. And so I'll just kind of flag a couple different ways that this plays out. And I apologize, my maps are all over the place. I was working with some online software a number of years back and was just kind of clicking around and playing with different options and tools and should have standardized everything, but I didn't. So this is a map of the international system of states out there. It's kind of color-coded based on how much power countries have. And so the dark green, United States and China and are sort of the most powerful states in the international system. And there's maybe a second tier, maybe India, Russia, some European states, Brazil maybe is in that tier. And then it kind of goes down from there. There's a handful with lesser power, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Iran. But we can kind of get a sense of where the major powers are in the international system. Another way of kind of thinking about that international system would be to switch around and say, okay, not just power, which is related to your military, which is related to your industrial capacity, which is related to your population. Let's just look at how wealthy you are. And what we find is that while the United States remains sort of at the top of that story as a wealthy country, other actors that pinged before, India and China, are much poorer. And so if we're thinking about questions about who's going to pay for international initiatives, that conversation gets a little bit different, right? The United States might say to China, you're a very powerful country, you should be contributing equally, and China might counter and say, our GDP per capita is about $4,500 per person, right? You are 10 to 12 times wealthier than we are. You are in a much better position to tax your population and pay for these different projects and initiatives. This is just an ongoing question about how do we resource things. Other countries in Western Europe also ping as much more wealthy than other parts of the world, even though before, when we were just thinking about power of individual countries, maybe they weren't sort of standing out as among that sort of top tier of most powerful actors. We could also slice it a different way and think about the values that countries hold. And so this is, again, a map where we're trying to think about the distribution of democratic principles. And so dark green is countries that are democracies, right? The United States, Canada, most of the Western Hemisphere, in fact, Western Europe, Eastern Europe mostly, Australia, New Zealand, and some other parts around the world, India, and elsewhere. But other powerful actors, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, aren't full democracies or aren't democracies in any respect, are authoritarian regimes, in some cases brutal authoritarian regimes. So how do you get these various different actors to work together when fundamental questions about what the relationship between people and their government should be we disagree about on a very foundational level. So the problem of cooperation is complex, right? That there's all these different ways in which the system divides and splits that can make it difficult for states to find common ground. Goldstein Piefhaus offers sort of three general strategies for thinking about what cooperation can look like in the international system, or how we get there. And so I'll just briefly run through these, and these are going to sort of ping over and over the course of the semester. And so it's good to kind of tuck them in the back of your head. One of those strategies is dominance, right? You can get cooperation, you can solve the collective action problem and get people to work together when you have a powerful state that's in a position to control the international system, that's able to impose its will, it's able to set rules, it's able to force others to play by those rules, incentivize them, and then you can get sort of order and structure. And so at the end of World War II, the United States was in a overwhelmingly dominant position and put in place a lot of systems and structures and rules for the international system that really were what the United States wanted to see in the international system, and were sustained because the United States had the power to make sure that other states bought into those systems and played by those rules. Another way that you can get cooperation is just kind of organically through a process of reciprocity, right? Reciprocity is just, I respond to you the way you respond to me, right? If you are nice to me, I am nice to you. If you're a jerk to me, I'm a jerk to you, right? This is the foundation of all human interactions. But in the context of international cooperation, it's important because I might be concerned about working with you, not sure if you're going to betray me, not sure if you're going to cheat, not sure if you're just going to follow through on what you say that you're going to do. And so we can take small steps. And I'm going to, do a small thing and work with you in a small, limited way. And if you respond and are a good partner and we can work together and cooperate, then that maybe encourages me to take another step of trusting you, cooperating with you, working with you. And so you can build up these dense networks of cooperation through mutual, working back and forth and behaving responsibly and in a trustworthy manner that can build up increasingly sophisticated patterns of cooperation over time. So that's a second story that you can tell about how we get cooperation in the international system. And the third story you can tell is related to the identity that states hold, right? So we do lots of things in our daily lives because that's sort of how we picture ourselves. I go to vote in every election, not because it's overwhelmingly fun or because it's profitable or because I don't have better things to do with my time. I vote because I view myself as a good citizen. I view myself as being an active and engaged citizen. And as an active and engaged citizen, to sort of align my behavior with how I think about myself, I need to go vote. That's part of what that involves. And so states, once they develop a sort of idea of I'm a good member of the international community, that implies filing your paperwork on time and being in compliance with different treaties and showing up at meetings and contributing in a constructive way, that all of those things that are foundational for cooperation, states are doing that because it feeds into this narrative about who they are and where they fit in the world. We see this a lot within the European Union, where being a member of the European Union brings with it sort of an expectation that you will be a good team player, you will cooperate, you will work together in good faith and advance sort of the collective interest, not just your own narrow self-interest. And I think that that's another useful way of thinking about how we can get to cooperation, is building these common identities where we see ourselves not just advocating for our own state, but advocating broadly for these shared visions and these shared goals that we hold tightly to and direct and drive our actions. So just because the problem is difficult, and it is difficult, cooperation under anarchy is a real challenge, it doesn't mean we're without tools or strategies to deal with that. And so a good chunk of this course is really wrestling with, here are our security problems, or here are economic problems, or governance problems, and how do states respond to that? How do they build that cooperation to make that work?